Welcome back. It would be nice to think that the eventual elimination of slavery through the 13th Amendment, the promise of equal civil rights for African Americans in the 14th Amendment, the promise of equal voting rights on account of race in the 15th Amendment. It would be nice to think that all of these things, even though they weren't done by the Founders, were really anticipated by the Founders, that the Founders put America on a path whereby things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would be the inevitable culmination of a Declaration of Independence that promised that and proclaimed that all men were created equal. It would be a nice story, but it's not true. The framers created, alas, a pro-slavery system, a system that actually got worse and worse and worse as time went on and actually collapsed, broke, fell because of the weight of slavery. The presidency, both in Article II and then in the 12th Amendment, was basically designed to advantage the slaveholding South because the 3/5 clause gave Southern slaveholding states extra clout in the Electoral College. The West was open to slavery constitutionally. Congress could prohibit slavery, but wasn't obliged to do so. And as a result of these facts, the presidency leaned toward the South. Slave states actually became more virulent, many of them in their defense of slavery, more aggressive in their commitment to slavery. They elected increasingly extreme pro-slavery presidents, from Jefferson to Jackson to Pierce and Buchanan. They shut down free speech in the South. It was a crime to criticize slavery in many parts of the South, a capital offense in many parts. North Carolina, for example. Preachers in the pulpit were imprisoned, prosecuted and imprisoned for preaching that slavery was a sin. When Northern congressmen tried to speak out against slavery, Southerners actually tried to indict them for their anti-slavery speech and demand that they stand trial down South. When Charles Sumner gives a speech against slavery, his head is smashed in by Charles Sumner is a Massachusetts anti-slavery senator, and when he gives a speech against slavery, his head is smashed in. He's almost killed by a pro-slavery Southern congressman named Preston Brooks, and the South actually enthusiastically supports Brooks and basically sends him letters saying, hit him again, next time. You didn't finish the job the first time. So the South wants to expand slavery not just into the Southwest, but into the Northwest, into Kansas and Nebraska, wants to acquire many Southern slavery expansionists, Cuba and Mexico, maybe even Brazil, to create a vast slavocratic empire. And there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that if they manage to get the votes. And one of the only reasons they don't manage to get the votes is actually kind of luck. Luckily, Americans tend to flow faster into the Northwest than into the Southwest. And so basically, anti-slavery forces win the foot race for Western land in general and are able to thwart some of the most extreme Southern pro-slavery policies. But let's be clear. Abe Lincoln wins in 1860 kind of not because of the Electoral College, in the spirit of the original Electoral College rules, but despite that. The Electoral College was rigged in favor of the pro-slavery South, and Lincoln wins nonetheless. He, as I said before, the first anti-slavery president in American history. And by anti-slavery, he's not extreme. He just is the first president to say, as president, slavery is wrong and we should eventually get rid of it. Now, John Quincy Adams is opposed to slavery. He doesn't love it. But as president, he's got a guy from South Carolina as his vice president, John C. Calhoun. He only starts talking about slavery after he leaves the presidency, when he no longer needs to get Southern votes in order to get himself into the White House. George Washington actually frees his slaves upon his death after he leaves the presidency, but doesn't, as president, ever say, my fellow Americans, we should put slavery on a path of ultimate extinction. I think he does signal that in a way on his deathbed, very kind of quietly. But Lincoln is the first openly anti-slavery president. And in fact, before Lincoln, there's no openly anti-slavery cabinet officer. And as we've seen, the judges, many of them are emphatically pro-slavery, put on the bench by pro-slavery presidents. So the system isn't getting gradually better on slavery thanks to the great wisdom of the framers. It would be nice if that were the story. That's not how it happened. The system is getting worse decade by decade. More slavery, more pro-slavery. Slavery is a cancer that's growing and growing, and you see it in the presidency, and thanks to the Electoral College, and you see it on the court in the Dred Scott case, and you see it in the states when they try to shut down political discourse, and you see it in the West with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and other things that are trying to basically expand slavery into the Northwest. So slavery is this cancer, and Lincoln manages to win despite the built-in headwinds against his anti-slavery vision. And if the South, the pro-slavery South, had been smart, you would never have had anything, even after Lincoln's election, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Lincoln doesn't get a popular majority. He gets less than 40% of the popular vote, a slim majority in the Electoral College, but not a popular mandate of any sort. His party doesn't have a control of the House or the Senate, in fact. So all the South has to do is just wait him out. They've been winning the game almost every time until Lincoln, and all they have to do is basically just say no to everything that Lincoln proposes, kind of call that like the Mitch McConnell strategy in Obama's first term. All they have to do to Lincoln is just say no, and Lincoln basically is a failed one-term president. He's not going to be able to accomplish very much. Here's what he can do. He can appoint anti-slavery governors of the Western Territories who will no longer participate in the rigging of elections in places like Kansas in favor of pro-slavery forces. So he can do a little bit in the West. He can try to ensure that abolitionist literature circulates in the South, because the South has basically banned anti-slavery pamphlets from circulating. So Lincoln, because he controls the post office, maybe can do that. Because he controls appointments of territorial governors, can do a little bit there. He can try to build a bit of a Republican Party in the South, but boy, it's going to be an uphill battle. Abe Lincoln gets 0 popular votes, not electoral votes, popular votes south of Virginia in 1860, because the South has become such a closed, intolerant society. Basically, in effect, it's a crime to be a member of the Republican Party and to support Lincoln's vision when you're down south. And Lincoln can try to do a little bit, but his prospects are pretty limited if the South simply basically shuts him down by staying at the table and blocking everything. But instead, the hotheads in South Carolina and elsewhere take up arms against a duly elected government. At Fort Sumter, fire upon the Union flag, even though Lincoln had been elected fair and square, and even though secession was unconstitutional under the founding for reasons that we've talked about at great length. But the hotheads in South Carolina first unilaterally declare their secession before Lincoln has even taken office in December of 1860, and then in early 1861, shortly after Lincoln's inaugural address. Lincoln hasn't done anything particularly provocative, really, but they launch an unprovoked bombardment of Fort Sumter. And as a result of that, their hot-headedness, they bring about something that was utterly unimaginable had they simply played the democratic game. The universal, immediate, uncompensated emancipation of slaves within the next 5 years. And it's just stunning that something like that could happen. Rarely in history have cannons backfired so explosively. So why, in retrospect, were they so dumb? But if they had played the game long term, maybe slavery might have ended, even on Lincoln's agenda, in 100 years. But they would have gotten 95 cents on the dollar. They would have gotten all the value of their slaves. They would have been able to transition to new economic ways of life. So why were they so dumb? And my answer basically is because they were arrogant and drunk with power and evil. Slavery is tyrannical. Tyrants actually live a life of arrogance, and they actually are contemptuous of others. They don't want to hear other points of view. So they were overconfident about their military prospects and their constitutional vision, and they shut down people who tried to say otherwise, who tried to argue, Southerners, that the slavery was actually not very good even for the South. They tried to shut down discourse, and as a result, they basically shot themselves in the foot. They, in the same way that lots of tyrants over the course of world history have basically made fundamental miscalculations because they shut down information flows, because they just didn't want to hear things that were at all critical of their opinions. And when you shut down information flow, you actually weaken your society in some very important ways. This is the long-term strength, it seems to me, of open, free, democratic cultures. Here's the story of how we eventually get the radical 13th Amendment. Lincoln gets elected despite the 12th Amendment. The South secedes by force of arms, and they put up a pretty good military show, and so eventually Lincoln is forced as a military measure to issue the Emancipation, and as a diplomatic measure, the Emancipation Proclamation. His initial proposal is simply, come back to the Union. I won't tinker with slavery in the States. You know, I'm going to stand on my platform of excluding slavery from the Western territories, but that's not really going to prejudice your economic interests in any immediate way. So, and I promise that I'm not going to mess with slavery in the States. And if you like, I'll support a constitutional amendment to that effect. That's what Lincoln says in his inaugural address, a very different kind of 13th Amendment. But the South spurns that deal. Lincoln is initially just trying to bring them back in, but after the war proceeds, in the fall of 1862, he issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which, as a war measure, is going to provide for the freeing of certain slaves in the rebel territories. Now, why does he do that? Again, it's as a war measure. Two ideas. One, he's worried as diplomat-in-chief. Remember, the foreign policy and geostrategic considerations the president has to keep in mind, because the Constitution is very much about national security and geostrategy. He's worried that England, that Britain, might recognize the Confederacy. They have certain economic interests. Southern cotton feeds and fuels British textile mills. And Britain doesn't care about American Union as such. Britain had fought against the American Revolution, had fought America in the War of 1812, has its own territories in the New World, Canada and elsewhere, and might not like nothing better, maybe from a certain imperial British point of view, that have the former American colonies sort of divided against themselves so Britain can play its classic divide and conquer game. So if it's just a war about American Union, maybe Britain sides with the South. But if it's a war to end slavery, if Lincoln can redefine the meaning of the war originally fought for union, but now Lincoln with the Emancipation redefines it as a war for freedom, for the end of slavery, British public opinion will not allow Britain to side with the South. Textile workers, even in Britain, at the risk of their own jobs, will actually support Lincoln's vision and will oppose any British effort to recognize the Confederacy. So there's a foreign policy dimension to the Emancipation Proclamation. Keep England out of America, just as the Revolution had been designed to sort of kick England out, keep them out. And there's a more immediate war aim. If you take all the Southern manpower represented by the slaves, that they're propping up the plantations, they're freeing up labor. If they working the fields, then they're freeing up the, masters and overseers, white labor, to fight on the battlefields. So they're helping the South for its basic economic base. If all those slaves instead stop helping the South and actually join the Northern cause, and maybe some of them join the Union Army, well, that's a lot of manpower to take from one pan of the scale and put it to the other, and Lincoln thinks that might very well be the margin of victory, and it turns out he's right. 180,000 blacks in blue end up fighting. Former slaves and their kinfolk in the Union in places like Kentucky flocked to the Union lines. You have all that manpower that had been supporting the Confederacy in effect, and now it's supporting the Union cause, and that's the margin of victory in some important respects. This will help a strategy that will culminate with smashing victories in not just places like Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but in Atlanta. And Lincoln wins re-election. And when he wins re-election, some of you have seen the movie Lincoln, he uses his renewed mandate to push through a 13th Amendment that's going to say slavery must end everywhere. And this is radical, not just in the former Confederacy, but even in Union states like Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware, Missouri. West Virginia has also sort of joined the Union during this time period. So slavery has to end everywhere, not just for rebel masters, but even for loyal Union masters in places like Kentucky. Slavery has to end everywhere immediately, now, not in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. Slavery ends now, immediately, and there's no compensation. And a later provision of the 14th Amendment will actually say it's illegal for a government, state or federal, to compensate the slave masters. So immediate, universal, uncompensated emancipation of a sort that no state had ever adopted before the Civil War. This is a radical moment in American history, made possible only because, actually, the South so overplayed its hand, generating a huge backlash and resulting in the carnage and cataclysm of the Civil War. Without that, you would have never had the 13th Amendment in the form. It was not some gradual fulfillment of the deep spirit of the founders who put America on a proper future course, even though they didn't eliminate slavery themselves. That'd be a nice story to tell, but that's not how it happened. The founders messed up on slavery. They created a pro-slavery system that got worse and worse and worse. This cancer, and the cancer became so bad it almost killed the patient, and radical measures were needed as a result, and Lincoln was able to do that only because of the Civil War, only because the South was dumb enough to secede, frankly. So that's the story of the 13th Amendment, and it ends with, it says, no slavery shall exist anywhere, and that means actually if a private person tries to enslave another individual, governments are obliged to intervene. This is a radical provision. It has no government action requirement. It limits even private parties. It requires government to act to free people from slavery. And there are all sorts of forms of slavery. There's agricultural slavery, there's sexual slavery, compelled prostitution, there's child abuse. Some of the slaves actually were children. There are many different forms of tyranny that we could think about as forms of slavery, and the 13th Amendment prohibits them all in Section 1 and gives Congress sweeping power to enforce that vision in Section 2. Remember, the Bill of Rights, in the afterglow of the American Revolution, begin Congress, which was about anxiety about an imperial center. So the American Revolution is localist, and the Bill of Rights that emerges says Congress shall make no law of a certain sort. Ends with the 10th Amendment, very states' rights-ish, very anti-federalist. But now the 13th Amendment is going to end with the words, Congress shall have power to enforce this. And by the way, we're going to see that sentence in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment too, because the Civil War is a war in which the good guys are not the state governments, the colonial governments, the seceders, but the central government. And so this new Constitution that's going to emerge after the Civil War, this new constitutional understanding, is going to be far more nationalist. Congress shall make no law. These are going to be amendments that, in fact, limit state institutions and practices like slavery. Well, you might think, okay, once you've gotten rid of slavery, job done, let's move on. And I think the Lincoln's party initially might think that, and then they immediately realize that they've miscalculated. Do the math. What happens once slavery ceases to exist? Now all these slaves become free blacks in the South. So how's that going to work? You still have the Electoral College. You still have the apportionment rules of the House of Representatives. Now all these free blacks who aren't being allowed to vote in the South will nevertheless count in the Electoral College, count in the House of Representatives census, but not at 3/5, because that's how they counted when they were slaves. They still counted, they still added to the Southern strength, but with a discount, 3/5. Now that they're freed, thanks to the 13th Amendment itself, they're going to count at 5/5. They're going to count for even more. So the concern is the South is going to come back into the House of Representatives, come back into the Electoral College with even more clout than it had before. Not letting its blacks vote, but getting even more votes, because now the 3/5 has become 5/5. And so the Republicans immediately realize that they're going to need at least another constitutional amendment, and that amendment is the 14th. And it's huge. It's probably the most important feature of our Constitution. We're going to talk about it again and again and again over the course of the lectures to follow. So let me just very briefly identify some of the things that the 14th Amendment does. Its first sentence says that everyone born in America is born an American citizen. We're all born citizens here. We're all born equal citizens here. Black and white. I would add male or female, Jew or Gentile, gay or straight, because it doesn't use the word race. This overturns the Dred Scott case, which said not just that slavery had to be allowed in the territories, but also that basically free blacks could not be citizens. And the 14th Amendment says, oh, yes, they can. Constitutionally, we're all created equal. We're all born equal. It's a constitutionalization of a radical reading, a broad reading, Lincoln's reading of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. That's the first sentence. It says everyone's an equal citizen in America, black as well as white. So you're not just free. It's not just that we're ending slavery. You are a citizen. You're an equal citizen. The next sentence of the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So now we move from a Bill of Rights that says Congress shall make no law to an amendment that says no state shall make a law. Remember, who misbehaved before in the Civil War? It's the state governments. And so now we're going to have, in effect, a second Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights against the state governments. We needed a Bill of Rights against the central government after the American Revolution, and we got one. But now we need a second Bill of Rights against state governments. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And note that some of the same words of the First Amendment are now appearing in the Fourth. No, shall, make, law, abridge. That's in the First Amendment. That's also in the 14th Amendment. But now it's no state. Now, what are these privileges or immunities that no state shall abridge? Fundamental things in America, like the Bill of Rights, like speech and press and petition and assembly and free exercise and a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures and due process and jury trials and right of counsel, etc., etc. These fundamental rights freedoms, privileges, and immunities, which had been before being guaranteed thanks to the Bill of Rights against the feds, are now going to be guaranteed against states, because states had misbehaved so badly, had shut down free speech and free press and even preachers in the pulpit, free exercise, and done all these things. And now we need a second Bill of Rights to make sure that they don't do that again. So you might say, well, gee, if the 14th Amendment was about, and this is a thing called incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states. That's how lawyers and judges talk about it. And you might think, well, gee, if it's about incorporating the Bill of Rights against the states, why doesn't it say Bill of Rights? And the answer is because it's about more than just the Bill of Rights. It's about other unenumerated rights and freedoms, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, proof beyond reasonable doubt, all sorts of other fundamental things, the right to testify in your own behalf as a criminal defendant, and all sorts of other fundamental rights and freedoms. So it's about even more than the Bill of Rights. And the phrasing that they used was apt, privileges and immunities of citizens, because, remember, the Constitution doesn't call these early amendments a Bill of Rights. We do today, but that's in large part because the framers of the 14th Amendment called them the Bill of Rights. The founders, not so much. The Supreme Court never referred to the early amendments as a Bill of Rights before the Civil War. They did refer to these amendments as privileges and immunities of citizens. And so the 14th Amendment says states can't mess with these things. And you might say, well, if states can't mess with these things, why did they say due process in the next sentence or the next clause? Because isn't due process a privilege or immunity that already is covered? So why a separate mention of due process? And the answer is the due process clause protects persons above and beyond citizens. The only folks protected by that first privileges or immunities idea are citizens. But the framers of the 14th Amendment thought persons deserved protection as well. And they also said persons deserve equal protection and due process. Now, here's one thing the 14th Amendment didn't do. It didn't guarantee a right to vote. You might say, well, why isn't voting a privilege or immunity of citizens? Well, remember in Article 4, way back when I go to, I'm a Connecticut person, to New York, I get all sorts of civil rights, but not a right to vote. Or to serve on a jury. So political rights under Article 4 were seen as not covered under privileges or immunities of interstate citizenship, nor are they covered by the 14th Amendment, which is about privileges and immunities of citizenship that I have against my own home government, not just when I go to New York, but against Connecticut. I have certain rights, speech, press, and so on, but the 14th Amendment doesn't quite give me a right to vote yet. Today, courts say equal protection gives you a right to vote. It's not so clear that originally that's what was intended, because remember, equal protection is about persons as distinct from citizens and aliens especially, and they've never had a right to vote before. And that's why all the framers of the 14th Amendment, actually, to a person, to a man, said this isn't about voting rights. This is about civil rights as opposed to voting rights. And why did they insist on that? Because they didn't have the votes at the time to get a voting rights amendment through. But they will, just shortly thereafter, with the 15th Amendment, get a voting rights amendment through. How are they able, with the 15th Amendment, to get through what they weren't able to do in the 14th Amendment? And the answer is the 14th Amendment did have some rules about voting. And the rules about voting, which are in Section 2, said if you don't let basically black people vote, then you get fewer seats in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. And then the framers of the 14th Amendment did one. So as a practical matter, that was going to really penalize the South because it had a lot of black people and not so much the North, which had fewer. And then the framers of the 14th Amendment did one other thing. They said, we're not going to let the Southern governments back into the House of Representatives and the Senate until they promise to let black people vote. And, in fact, until they ratify the 14th Amendment. And you might say, well, why was that okay? And that's because, basically, these Southern governments were un-Republican. They didn't have free speech. They didn't have free press. They weren't letting black people vote. Black people were a majority in some of the Southern states, a huge plurality in others. And so it just wasn't right. Once these slaves become free, you can't prevent them from voting. If they're slaves, that's one thing. It's like aliens can't vote. But once an alien becomes a citizen, it's very different to prevent them from voting. Once these slaves become free, it's very different to prevent them from voting. Yes, some northern states prevented blacks from voting, but that was a small percentage of the population, say the Republicans, 1%, 2%. Whereas in the South, it's 60%, 50%, 40%, 35%. It's much different to exclude a huge population base. So how do you get the 15th Amendment? Once you impose black suffrage on the South, then they come back into Congress, and these new Congress people will support an amendment to constitutionalize that everywhere, to have black suffrage in the North too. And that's the 15th Amendment. Now, who's upset by all of this? Among others, women. They're saying, why are you enfranchising black people before, some of whom are illiterate, many of whom are illiterate? Why are poor, illiterate black men getting the vote before Radcliffe and Smith educated white women? And there are a couple of arguments. One is that blacks fought on the battlefield, and voting rights are connected to arms bearing. And another is you can count on men to protect the women in their lives. When the men vote, they'll protect their wives and mothers and daughters and sisters, but you can't count on whites to protect blacks. So we're going to come back to that story. And the women are not quite mollified by these stories. So they're going to, once we have an amendment that says in the 15th Amendment, no abridgment of voting rights on account of race, women are going to say, let's add sex to that. And that's going to be a story that we're going to come back to in the next couple of lectures. But I'm going to end this one by, once again, reminding you of the image in the accompanying chapter of America's Constitution, a biography. It's chapter 10. Shall I trust these men? This is Lady Columbia, America. Shall I trust these men, these former Confederates? They want sort of back in. Shall I let them back in, Robert Lee and others? Shall I trust these men? And not this man, a black man who's lost his limb in service of America. He's wearing a Union coat and a Union uniform. Black men win rights initially rights to be free, later rights to be an equal citizen, and eventually rights to be an equal voter, because they fight and bleed for the Union on the battlefield of glory. Remember the story with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick in that movie, the Massachusetts 54th. So once again, here we see deep connections of the three great themes of American history. Democracy. Democracy is being extended to those, to black men. National security, in part because of a war that gives them a chance to shine and show their stuff, their virtue. So national security and democracy and the story of slavery. But now we move from a pro-slavery constitution before the war to an emphatically anti-slavery constitution after the war. That's the great Reconstruction. That's the constitution we live in today. Now, Lady Columbia is a female embodiment, and as I said, she's personified here as white. Many women are not very happy that they're being cut out of this deal. There's going to be another great war in America at the beginning of the 20th century, World War I, and women are going to get the vote in that war and because of that war. So the national security story that we see here, that we saw at the founding and that we see in the Civil War, will continue. And that's the story, among others, of the next two lectures. So please stay tuned. Of slavery, more aggressive in their commitment to slavery. They elected increasingly extreme pro-slavery presidents, from Jefferson to Jackson to Pierce and Buchanan. They shut down free speech in the South. It was a crime to criticize slavery in many parts of the South, a capital offense in many parts. North Carolina, for example. Preachers in the pulpit were imprisoned, prosecuted and imprisoned for preaching that slavery was a sin. When Northern congressmen tried to speak out against slavery, Southerners actually tried to indict them for their anti-slavery speech and demand that they stand trial down South. When Charles Sumner gives a speech against slavery, his head is smashed in by, Charles Sumner is a Massachusetts anti-slavery senator, and when he gives a speech against slavery, his head is smashed in. He's almost killed by a pro-slavery Southern congressman named Preston Brooks, and the South actually enthusiastically supported. Welcome back. It would be nice to think that the eventual elimination of slavery through the 13th Amendment, the promise of equal civil rights for African Americans in the 14th Amendment, the promise of equal voting rights on account of race in the 15th Amendment. It would be nice to think that all of these things, even though they weren't done by the founders, were really anticipated by the founders, that the founders put into advantage the slaveholding South because the 3/5 clause gave Southern slaveholding states extra clout in the Electoral College. The West was open to slavery constitutionally. Congress could prohibit slavery, but wasn't obliged to do so. And as a result of these facts, the presidency leaned toward the South. Slave states actually became more virulent, many of them in their defense. America on a path whereby things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would be the inevitable culmination of a Declaration of Independence that promised that and proclaimed that all men were created equal. It would be a nice story, but it's not true. The framers created, alas, a pro-slavery system, a system that actually got worse and worse and worse as time went on and actually collapsed, broke, fell because of the weight of slavery. The presidency, both in Article II and then in the 12th Amendment, was basically designed